I might get Paul to take us through some of the history and some of the reasons why maybe initially we thought, or some people thought, that seed oils were healthy, and what the evidence is now. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Peter. So I guess it's this is the same old story, isn't it, Peter? We've just been led down the garden path. We've been misled, and you'd well know this too, Nicole. I mean, with your teaching, you would have had mainstream teaching like I have. You've been taught that saturated fat equals bad, seed oil, vegetable oil equals good. And the notion of this, again, is due to the properties in supposedly lowering LDL cholesterol. The problem is the chemical property of seed oils, which allows them to be liquid, is also the chemical property that makes them very reactive. And they can actually do damage to the tissues of our bodies through something called free radicals. So the way to understand it is, and we don't really have to get down into the nitty-gritty of it, but having different kinds of bonds can determine whether a fat is an oil or a solid. And seed oils have a particular kind of bond that is very reactive. In the same way that metal can rust through a process called oxidation, these oils are actually oxidized in the bottle. And they actually have to put them through a lot of industrial processes like bleaching and, trying to deodorize them. Otherwise, we would absolutely never consume them. And it's not a stretch to say that they were originally machine lubricants that then were repurposed as an industrialized food item. Now, the problem is that when we consume vegetable and seed oils, we consume these oxidation products, and that leads to inflammation inside us. Basically, what happens is through our digestive tract, these things called free radicals, otherwise you might have heard the term reactive oxygen species, it's just another way of saying the same thing, these get absorbed across our intestines and enter our bloodstream, where they get delivered to the liver. And when they get to the liver, they can actually directly cause something called fatty liver disease, which most people would have heard about, and is strongly associated with something called insulin resistance, which again, most diabetics, if they haven't heard about it, they've certainly experienced it, because that's one of the core problems in type 2 diabetes. It's insulin resistance that actually prevents you from controlling your blood glucose levels effectively. Now, I don't know, have you ever come across the rose corn oil study, Peter? It's an old one.
I have. It's an oldie but a goodie.
And I quite like it because we have actually talked about this before, so that was a bit of a loaded question. But they did some, as well as finding that the people who consume the corn oil were more likely to die, which we can put aside for a moment, they had some subjects who were diabetic. And as you know, in previous, ancient eras, we're talking many hundreds of years ago, one of the main ways that diabetes was diagnosed was by actually tasting somebody's urine. This is because diabetes is a condition where the sugar in the blood goes too high. And if it gets excessively high, some of that sugar actually leaks out into the urine. We get overflow. So there's actually accounts of ancient people where they would document that people who were sick before they were about to die, the ants would actually come and feed on their urine, hunting out the sugar. So basically, the point is, if you have sugar in your urine, it's a bad sign, and it's often associated with diabetes. Now, in the Rose corn oil study, Rose was just the name of the lead investigator, they actually identified that subjects, when they consumed the corn oil, they developed this sugar in their urine. When they stopped the corn oil, the sugar went away. And then they trialled it again. This is what we call an ABA design. And they did the intervention again. They gave the corn oil back and the sugar came back. And they could do this as many times as they wanted. They were able to definitively demonstrate that the consumption of a vegetable or a seed oil in place of the regular saturated fat was actually associated with worsening control of the diabetes. One of the causes, it depends on where the inflammation is. Let's assume that this is leg swelling, which is very, very common. Essentially, if your heart is not working properly, that can lead to swelling of your legs. Basically, what happens is that the blood vessels in the legs, they're like long pipes that go up to the heart. And the heart is meant to receive the fluid coming up these pipes and pump it through. Now, if the heart isn't able to pump the blood through or receive it properly, then the pressure in these pipes builds up. It becomes excessive. And in that case, some of the excess fluid can actually seep across the wall, what we call hydrostatic pressure. And when that fluid that seeps across the wall of the blood vessels, that will actually waterlog the tissue. And as doctors, we can often diagnose this by putting our big, ugly thumbs into the shins and keeping it there for a few seconds. And when we take it away, it can leave a dimple. And that's what we call pitting edema. And if you see pitting edema, that can be a sign, basically, potentially, not always, but potentially a sign of something we call congestive cardiac failure, an early sign where the heart is just struggling to do its job properly. So if that's the kind of edema you're talking about, and that's getting better, that's a good thing. And it's probably because your heart is more effective. One of the other reasons I commonly see in my patients with swelling of the legs is that if they have a lot of abdominal fat, it can actually compress the veins around their pelvis region. And that will also lead to the blood pressure building up in the same way that the heart not working properly will, and the fluid can seep across the blood vessels again. So that's probably the kind of edema or swelling that Zeb is talking about. But of course, there's other kinds. If you have an infection or if your immune system is attacking your joint, such as a rheumatoid arthritis, or if you have an attack of gout, then you'll have a localized swelling to the particular joint that's affected. Polymyalgia rheumatica is actually usually associated with very high levels of something else called ESR, which stands for erythrocyte sedimentation rate. Now, basically, that's a really long term, but erythrocyte means red blood cell, and sedimentation rate just means the sediment like you get at the bottom of a glass of orange juice when you used to drink it. So what it actually does is that when our red blood cells, when we're inflamed, we actually have a little protein called fibrinogen that actually coats our red blood cells and makes them stick together. And when they clump together, they're more likely to they get denser and they fall down to the bottom of the fluid, so they sediment out. Now, this ESR, or erythrocyte sedimentation rate, is a major diagnostic criteria for the disease of polymyalgia rheumatica. And frequently, when people go on diets that lower their inflammation, we see a significant lowering of their ESR. And again, in the same way that the reference range for CRP, I think, is unrealistically optimistic, then I think the diagnostic threshold for ESR is also set far, far too high. And one of the problems is that our laboratories don't account for something called healthy aging. The notion that you should be as healthy in your 60s as you were in your 30s is just foreign to these reference ranges. So a case in point is that for a 20-year-old person, the upper limit of the reference range for ESR might be 15, and yet for somebody who's a bit older, it will be set at double that at 30. They're quite literally accepting double the inflammation in somebody just because they're a little bit older, which makes no plausible biological sense. And it sort of discounts the possibility that we can actually age healthily in modern society. And maybe that's an indictment on modern lifestyle. So a lot of people, they'll know that they're not hungry. They'll instinctively know they're not hungry, and yet they'll have this insatiable urge for cravings, for eating something like an ice cream or something like that. And the understanding is that that urge is actually driven by the chemistry within the brain. It's not a need for nutrients. It's a need for a warm hug from food.
I just want to go back to the Sydney Diet Heart Study, because what they promoted from that study was that the polyunsaturated fats, the seed oils, were actually healthier than the saturated, which was exact opposite to what the results showed. So tell us a little bit about that, and because there are a number of other similar studies as well, the Minnesota study as well, that they promoted, or basically they lied about the results. Is that
it was a cover-up? It was an out-and-out cover-up. So as I said, the study was finished in 1973, and yet the data on mortality was not published until 2014. And that was actually uncovered by a researcher by the name of Dr. Christopher Ramsden, who actually found it in the basement of one of the deceased lead investigators. And they had to go and retrieve it out. It was on magnetic tapes and data sets and punch cards, I kid you not. And they had to go and they had to go to a computer laboratory who was able to get some ancient computer equipment so they could decode it. And then they had to validate it against the known population data to make sure it was reliable. But they were able to validate the data to a sufficient level where it was able to be published in the British Medical Journal, one of the world's leading and most prestigious journals. The curious thing here is, and I'll just leave you with a thought bubble, so given that this study predated the food pyramid, the implementation of the food pyramid, if that data had not been covered up, would we have ever been subjected to the food pyramid? As you say, it's not an isolated finding. We've just talked about one, but the Women's Health Initiative, the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, there are two other large-scale randomized controlled trials. And when we're talking about the hierarchy of medical evidence, understand that this study design is at the very top. So a lot of these food pyramid advocates will cite what we call epidemiological research, which is way down the bottom, while ignoring the best quality experimental research we have. It's a complete non sequitur.
Nicole, from a food point of view, I mean, where do we find them, and how do we reduce our reliance, I guess, on these seed oils?
Yeah, well, I guess as Paul was talking about as well, is that, if we're eating unprocessed and real food, then I guess that's the best way to avoid that whole bucket of seed oil issue. As I talk to a lot of my clients, the first thing we sort of run down is, understanding how to avoid sugar and how to reduce total carbohydrate intake in their diet. And I go through label reading with them so that they can navigate, what's a low carb, no added sugar product. Once we've done that, then we really have to start navigating the whole seed vegetable oil issue, which is really about them checking their ingredients lists really carefully. Again, if we're going down the unprocessed pathway and we're eating, good quality protein like meat, chicken, fish, eggs, these don't really have ingredients lists. So, I always say if it doesn't really have an ingredients list, then you're eating real food.
Inflammation is a term I personally don't like because it's got such a protean presentation. It can be so varied. So you might have a rash, you might have psoriasis, you might have flaky skin, you might have an aching joint, an aching big toe, an aching knee. You might be depressed, and in a lot of cases, depression and anxiety can be consequent to inflammation. You might have abdominal pain. It really can manifest in any number of ways. So I think it's much better to just say it's the absence of inflammation, which is actually what defines good health. The simple fact is that we've got a couple of blood tests where we actually can measure, and they're very crude measures of inflammation. They're what we call sensitive, but not specific. What that means is that if you are inflamed, these markers will likely be out of whack. But if they're out of whack, it won't tell you where the source of inflammation is. It could have been a cold that you got 2 days ago. You could have broken your toe. You could have a rash, what have you. So they're very imprecise. But one of these markers is called C-reactive protein. And when we actually look at people's longevity versus their C-reactive protein, we find that the people with the very highest levels do incredibly poorly. And the interesting thing about this is that the normal reference range on the blood tests actually is usually between 0 and 5, when we've actually got very, very good research that anything over 1 and probably over half is actually associated with early mortality. So I guess in terms of how can we present, well, if you're not feeling 100%, there's a very good chance that you are carrying inflammation of some sort. That could be autoimmune inflammation, where your immune system is attacking you. That could be an infection, your body responding to an infection. That could be something like a cancer. It could be a physical trauma where you've sprained your ankle. There's multiple ways that you can sustain inflammation. The problem is, though, that once you are inflamed, you're in a far worse state of health, and there's only one solution, and that's to try and improve it. And don't trust the standard reference range on bloods, because that is not set based on what is optimal for your health. When your doctor looks at that and says, oh, your CRP is 3, well done, because it's under the 5 that the flag post is set, that is not a marker of good health. So that's set based on 95% of the population. If you walk around the shops now, you can see that 95% of the population is unhealthy rather than being healthy. And we're using 95% of the population to determine what inflammatory goals we should aim for on bloods. That's just crazy. Basically, look, if you have pain, you're probably inflamed. If you have a defect in your skin, you're probably inflamed. We're now understanding this concept of what we call neural inflammation, whereas we know mental conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disease, severe depression, anxiety, these are associated with inflammation of the nervous system. So if you're not in optimal health, you're going to be inflamed. And it's not just about the diabetes. And so obviously we say, well, you consume the seed oils, you get a little bit of sugar in your urine. Is it really that much of a problem? So you'd be familiar with the Sydney Diet Heart Study. So this was actually ran between 1966 and 1973 from memory, approximately those years. And they actually recruited males who had had heart attacks. So the population you would consider very, very high risk. And then they randomized them to either go on a standard diet to keep on having what you were having, which was saturated fat, rich foods, no doubt, or to take out the saturated fats in their diet and replace it with seed oils. And what they actually found was that the males who consumed the seed oils actually had an increased death rate of 62%. Hugely significant increase in death rate. So it's not just some kind of esoteric or abstract concept we're talking about. We'll say, you consume seed oils and you absorb this oxidative stress, and it might make these metrics bad. The final outcome that we really care about, which is good health and longevity, that is significantly impaired. And I won't bore everybody with other studies. I'm sure as you've heard me talking on this subject before, you've probably heard me talk about it ad nauseum. But there is a couple of other points that we do need to talk about. One of them being that if you are a diabetic, then the oxidation from seed oils is far more damaging to you than a non-diabetic. So they did this really elegant study where they had subjects actually consume oxidized oil, and then they measured their blood to see how long they had these circulating free radicals in their blood for, and understand that these free radicals, when they're circulating, they're not benign. They're doing bad stuff. They're damaging. And they found that diabetics with good control of their sugars or non-diabetics, they could detect these free radicals for 8 hours on average. Poorly controlled diabetics, care to hazard a guess, Nicole or Peter, how long they lasted for?
What, twice that?
9 times longer, 72 hours longer. So the persistence of these free radicals in the circulation doing damage that was measurable following consumption of a seed oil was 8 hours versus 3 days. So just consider that for a moment. So again, this is not some esoteric abstract construct that is irrelevant to diabetes. It is incredibly relevant. And this goes to the heart of what you talk about, Peter. You talk about real food. So it's not just about, this macronutrient or that macronutrient. It's about having the combination or avoiding the combination of ingredients that are found in industrially produced foods. And obviously that includes sugars, carbohydrates coming in under that umbrella, and seed oil. So it's a deadly combination. It's not one or the other in isolation. You mentioned how seed oils might actually affect appetite, and this is something that a lot of people don't know about. There's a term of something called nutritional immunity. And what it actually means is that our immune systems have got a fantastic strategy where our bodies understand that pathogens that will infect us, things like viruses and bacteria, different parasites, they rely on iron to survive. And as far as they're concerned, we're a smorgasbord. We've got iron circulating around in our blood, ready to go. Now, with our immune system, when we get an inflammation trigger, our body does its best to take that iron out of our free circulation and push it into storage. So what we call our serum iron, which is the free iron in our blood, will actually go down, and the iron in our storage reservoirs, called ferritin, will actually go up. And that has a beautiful effect because it effectively starves these pathogens of the iron they need. And our immune systems can go on and do their business and eradicate the infection. And then once the infection's gone, that inflammatory signal from the infection is removed and the iron level is restored back to normal in our blood. The trouble is when we have inflammation from artificial causes, things like seed oils, which we know are inflammatory, well, we don't ever get any respite from this concept of nutritional immunity. It means that the level of circulating iron is always going to be lower. It's not going to be transient lower for a week or two. It's going to be lower for as long as you're inflamed. And if you've got chronic disease, that can be months and years at a time. And this has very real consequences. And one of them is actually on binge eating, believe it or not. So the chemicals in our brain that make us feel good. So human survival is predicated on two behaviours, procreation and eating. And they're driven by these chemicals in our brain called the catecholaminergic neurotransmitters, so dopamine and serotonin. And they both have an iron-dependent synthesis. In plain English, we need iron to make these chemicals. And without having sufficient iron, as in if in an inflamed state, our production of these chemicals is going to be suppressed. And this is absolutely provable biochemistry 101. Now, if we have less of these chemicals and understand that we're hardwired, we have this physiological drive to chase these chemicals, remember the behaviours of eating and procreation are actually driven by these chemicals. That's how the human brain is hardwired. So without these chemicals, we have an urge to engage in behaviours that will actually lift that grey veil, if you will, of apathy from us and actually give us a squirt of these chemicals into our brain. And what's the most reliable way of doing that in our modern society? Junk food. It's ready, it's always accessible, and it's been crafted to have what we call the bliss point, which is basically to make it as appealing and addictive as possible to squirt these chemicals back in. So we end up in the situation where we become chronically inflamed. We actually have suppression of our body's ability to synthesize dopamine and serotonin, and that then sets us up to have these cravings. One of the causes, it depends on where the inflammation is. Let's assume that this is leg swelling, which is very, very common. Essentially, if your heart is not working properly, that can lead to swelling of your legs. Basically, what happens is that the blood vessels in the legs, they're like long pipes that go up to the heart. And the heart is meant to receive the fluid coming up these pipes and pump it through. Now, if the heart isn't able to pump the blood through or receive it properly, then the pressure in these pipes builds up. It becomes excessive. And in that case, some of the excess fluid can actually seep across the wall, what we call hydrostatic pressure. And when that fluid that seeps across the wall of the blood vessels, that will actually waterlog the tissue. And as doctors, we can often diagnose this by putting our big, ugly thumbs into the shins and keeping it there for a few seconds. And when we take it away, it can leave a dimple. And that's what we call pitting edema. And if you see pitting edema, that can be a sign, basically, potentially, not always, but potentially a sign of something we call congestive cardiac failure, an early sign where the heart is just struggling to do its job properly. So if that's the kind of edema you're talking about, and that's getting better, that's a good thing. And it's probably because your heart is more effective. One of the other reasons I commonly see in my patients with swelling of the legs is that if they have a lot of abdominal fat, it can actually compress the veins around their pelvis region. And that will also lead to the blood pressure building up in the same way that the heart not working properly will, and the fluid can seep across the blood vessels again. So that's probably the kind of edema or swelling that Zeb is talking about. But of course, there's other kinds. If you have an infection, or if your immune system is attacking your joint, such as in a rheumatoid arthritis, or if you have an attack of gout, then you'll have a localized swelling to the particular joint that's affected. Polymyalgia rheumatica is actually usually associated with very high levels of something else called ESR, which stands for erythrocyte sedimentation rate. Now, basically, that's a really long term, but erythrocyte means red blood cell, and sedimentation rate just means the sediment like you get at the bottom of a glass of orange juice when you used to drink it. So what it actually does is that when our red blood cells, when we're inflamed, we actually have a little protein called fibrinogen that actually coats our red blood cells and makes them stick together. And when they clump together, they're more likely that they get denser and they fall down to the bottom of the fluid, so they sediment out. Now, this ESR, or erythrocyte sedimentation rate, is a major diagnostic criteria for the disease of polymyalgia rheumatica. And frequently, when people go on diets that lower their inflammation, we see a significant lowering of their ESR. And again, in the same way that the reference range for CRP, I think, is unrealistically optimistic, then I think the diagnostic threshold for ESR is also set far, far too high. And one of the problems is that our laboratories don't account for something called healthy aging. The notion that you should be as healthy in your 60s as you were in your 30s is just foreign to these reference ranges. So a case in point is that for a 20-year-old person, the upper limit of the reference range for ESR might be 15, and yet for somebody who's a bit older, it will be set at double that at 30. They're quite literally accepting double the inflammation in somebody just because they're a little bit older, which makes no plausible biological sense. And it sort of discounts the possibility that we can actually age healthily in modern society. And maybe that's an indictment on modern lifestyle.